were limited to the endurance of our organs. God gave us each a set of organs, and when these gave way, that was it. Along came modern technology and said, no, you can go to the garage and get a new battery, a new alternator, a new set of tires. We can reach out beyond the patient's body and get spare parts that weren't provided with the original human machine, and life will continue. In the United Kingdom, there are about 6,000 people who are waiting for an organ transplant that will save or dramatically improve their life. In 2018-19, which is the last year for which we have a complete set of statistics, about 400 people died while waiting for an organ transplant, and close to 800 were removed from the list due to deteriorating health. So what does Judaism have to say about donating or receiving an organ? I'm going to share with you a real-life story that took place a few years ago. It's regarding a young girl, Renata Daniels, who was born with congenital renal anomalies. And at the age of 5, she needed an organ transplant, which she received from a deceased donor. Unfortunately, a few years down the line, her body rejected that organ. And her body, if you don't mind, just make sure to mute yourselves. Her body rejected that organ, and she needed another organ. At this stage, her father offered to donate one of his kidneys. Nothing unusual about that, except for the fact that the father was incarcerated at the expense of the United States government, and therefore they were going to have to pay for the treatment. Again, nothing majorly exciting, it all went fine. She received the kidney. Unfortunately, a few years later, that kidney was again rejected. At this stage, her father made the unprecedented offer to donate his second kidney, putting his life at serious risk. He said, what have I ever done for my daughter? I've not really done much for society. I'd like to at least redeem myself and save my daughter's life. The hospital ethics committee refused outright. The family insisted, and the matter was referred to further consideration. So we've got a young girl who received a kidney from a deceased donor. She received a kidney from a living donor, and she's now being offered a kidney by a living donor when the transplant would leave the donor in serious danger. So just quickly grab a pen or pencil, and without thinking too deeply, just jot down, what do you think Jewish law has to say about these 3 scenarios? Is it forbidden, permitted, or perhaps obligated to donate organs from a deceased person? Is it the same questions regarding a live donor? And finally, if that donation will seriously impact the health of the donor. We're going to revisit these questions at the end. It'd be interesting to see whether your attitude has changed as a result of what you've heard. Just share with you a little bit of the medical background. So one of the most significant breakthroughs, and really perhaps one of the most simple at the same time, was all the way back in 1902, when the method to join blood vessels was finally mastered. Until then, they could stitch you up if you had an injury, but they couldn't actually join veins, arteries, and so on in a manner that would allow a seamless join, preventing blood clots and so on. Once this was mastered, the mechanical element of organ transplantation was now possible. You could take a part from one body and attach it to another. Lots of experimentation was going on. There was a lot of outcry by animal rights organizations because dogs were primarily used and monkeys in the early experimentation, but they couldn't overcome one very serious problem. And that serious problem was that the body is engineered to reject anything foreign. So as soon as they placed a kidney or any other organ into a recipient, within a very short period of time, the body destroyed it. In 1954, they had a slight breakthrough. They were able to carry out a successful kidney transplant between a set of identical twins. The body therefore didn't reject the kidney because the DNA was the same. So it was able to demonstrate that as if they could overcome this rejection problem, an organ from one person could work when reconnected to somebody else. The next big breakthrough was in 1967 when the first heart transplant was carried out. This made waves throughout the world. Not necessarily was it such a major medical breakthrough because it's probably more complicated to transplant a liver than it is a heart, but it was seen as a very emotive issue. The heart was always seen as the seat of life. There was all sorts of controversy as to whether Barnard really could claim to have made that breakthrough, or was he really just piggybacking on the back of experimentation carried out in the United States. Either way, he goes down in history as being that first person. Shortly after that, things ground to a halt because it was very much an experimental form of treatment. Humans were being treated as guinea pigs. Of the 162 heart transplants that were carried out between 1968 and 1970, 144 died within a few weeks. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, one of the leading halachic authorities of the 20th century, deemed it double murder. You were murdering the donor and you were murdering the recipient. Now, it's true to say that those recipients were certainly extremely ill and would have probably died within a relatively short period of time had they not received a heart transplant. Nevertheless, it was felt that people were being used as human guinea pigs, and within many countries, there was a moratorium on heart transplants shortly after this massive breakthrough. The big discovery came in the early 70s when the immunosuppressive properties of cyclosporine were discovered. Cyclosporine is a type of fungus, and it was discovered that this could suppress the immune system. Until then, they were trying all sorts of things, full body radiation, and various other regimes that had a massive, massive effect on the person's ability to survive, having had such an intensive regime of suppressing the immune system. It wasn't known
on the TV.
Cyclosporine really became widely available, and this is when transplantation medicine really began to take off, when the side effects of suppressing the immune system were seen to be less than the side effect of not having the treatment, and medicine and transplants really began to take off all over the world. Just a useless bit of trivia, if you ever want to use this fact, you can ask people, how is it possible to donate your heart and still be alive? We know that you can give your kidneys. Perhaps it gives a new meaning to the term when you call somebody heartless. But what it's actually telling us, a domino heart transplant is an amazing thing, which is that medically, a lung transplant is often more successful if you receive a new set of lungs and heart at the same time. So you may have a diseased set of lungs and a relatively healthy heart. So you will be able to donate your healthy heart to somebody else, and your lungs, and you will receive a new set of lungs and heart. Very, very rare operation. Although amazingly, at a talk I gave a few weeks ago, somebody put in the chat that his brother had been a domino heart donor. Probably one of the most amazing feelings that you can give your heart to save somebody else's life. We're going to fast forward to 2015 when the opt-out system was introduced in Wales. So until then, if you wish to donate an organ, you have to actively choose and say, I would like to give this organ when I'm no longer alive. The law was changed in Wales in 2015 that unless you actively said, I do not want to give my organs, you would be considered a potential organ donor. In 2019, that was introduced to England and it became law on the 20th of May, 2020. So where does that leave us as Jews now? What do we need to do? Do we need to opt out? Can we opt in? Can we do nothing? Will our organs be stolen from us if we drop dead in the middle of the Pennines? If Uncle Yankel is visited from Jerusalem and eats a bit too much cholent at the Kiddush and has a heart attack, is he at risk? What are the facts about this situation? We will see that a little bit later in the evening. The number of people needing a transplant is expected to rise steeply over the next decade due to an aging population, increased obesity, leading to an increase in kidney failure. And on the positive side, scientific advances mean that more people are suitable to receive an organ transplant. One donor can give a heart, lungs, 2 kidneys, a pancreas, a liver, the small bowel, and restore the sight of 2 people by donating their corneas. We can also give bone and tissue such as skin, heart valves, tendons. Skin grafts are used for people who've had severe burns. Bones are used in orthopedic surgery. So one person could do an enormous amount of good. In fact, there was a fascinating discussion in the Journal of Medical Ethics by somebody called John Harris, a bioethicist who lectures now in Manchester University, who put forward a concept called the survival lottery. If you want to use utilitarian ethics and look at what will produce the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people, then perhaps we should have a lottery and every 10,000th person will be chosen, put to sleep, harvest their organs, and we can save an enormous amount of lives at the loss of one person. Clearly, John Smith was only bringing this up. He wasn't meaning to say that this was an absolute idea that should be taken seriously, but it all serves to broaden the boundaries of debate and to raise a bit more awareness of the issues. Most organ donors die as a result of a brain hemorrhage, severe head injury, stroke, and are on a ventilator in a hospital intensive care unit. But increased road safety and better medical intervention means that fewer in both groups are dying. Until recently, the 18 to 49-year-old group was the overwhelming largest group of potential donors. That has started to change, and now middle-aged people are slowly creeping up and becoming more and more the potential donors, primarily due to our poorer health, our increased obesity, lack of exercise, and so on. And while the number of donors has increased overall over the past 10 years, there's been some interesting changes. So in 2018-19, 38% of donors were aged 60 or over, compared to only 26% a decade earlier. The number of donors aged over 70 increased from 8% to 15%, and the number of clinically obese donors, measured as a BMI of higher than 30, increased from 24% to 29%. While this has increased the pool of organs, what's remained to be seen is what the impact on the quality and duration of these organs will be once they are transplanted. In 2009-10, there were about 16 million people on the organ donor register and about 959 donors. Fast forward a decade, there were then 25 million people on the organ donors register and only 1,600 deceased donors. So what are these figures telling us? Let's look at a breakdown of the people that die in the United Kingdom. Every year, there are approximately 600,000 people a year dying. Of those, however, just under half occur in hospital. What's the significance of this? Let's go back to our motor car analogy. If the battery is dead in Rabbi Pink's Transit, is not going to work in Robertson Pink's, what she got, the Fiesta, whatever, the
Ford Focus.
Focus, right? If it's not working in one car, it's not going to work in the other. If the heart is not working for Harry, it's not going to be working for Sally. As soon as a person dies, the organ begins to deteriorate. We need to be able to retrieve that organ extremely quickly in order for it to be viable. So unless, if a person is dying at home, there's no way that their organs are going to be in a state that they can be useful for somebody else. Even if they're dying in a hospital, unless they can be linked up immediately to a life support machine, which will provide oxygen to the organs, then those organs will deteriorate to a stage that they cannot be used. Remember, we don't have a specialist retrieval team in every hospital in the United Kingdom. So once we know that a person is possibly a potential donor, we need to get that retrieval team activated over to the hospital. There may well be a lapse between the person passing away and the organs being retrieved. So in order for those organs to be suitable, that person needs to be linked to a respirator. And what we've seen in recent times as a result of this COVID-19 pandemic is that when we look at the league table of number of respirators per 100,000 of population, we're not a Liverpool, we're not a Leicester City, we're not even an Aston Villa right there at the bottom of the Premier League. We're one of these third or fourth division teams as far as the number of respirators are concerned. So the possibility of a person dying and actually being linked up to a respirator is very, very low. In fact, only 1.17% of all people who die in the United Kingdom are potential donors. We then move from the potential donors, which mean that a person has passed away, they are linked to a life support machine. We then need to look at how many are eligible. Eligible means that there's no medical contraindications, so they don't have, let's say, perhaps hepatitis, active cancer, or other diseases that will rule out their organs' usefulness for somebody else. We also have to exclude, we then come down, so we've had 7,000 potential donors. We've knocked 1,000 off because there've been medical contraindications. We've now got another big drop from close to 6,000 eligible donors to about 3,000 where requests. So only about 50% of all potential donors are actually asked whether they'd like their organs to be given. What's the reason for this? The reason is twofold. Sometimes it may be that the family have already made their wishes very clear. In other situations, it may be because what's called the SNODS, the specialist nurse for organ donation, was not available and able to make the request, or they may have felt uncomfortable doing so. And this is what the change of law is all about. They're not looking to get the 1,600 donors to change to 290,000. First of all, they just wouldn't even have the capacity in this country to carry out anywhere near that sort of number, even though the government has given assurances that they will provide greater resources to enable an increase in number of potential donors to be coped with. What they are looking for is to get a narrowing of the gap between 5,815 and 1,600. And how are they going to go about this? So I'm trying to raise some funds. All rabbis always occupied with raising funds for the various projects they're trying to run. So I think that I'm going to go and approach Mr. Goldberg. I knock on his door and I'm trying to work out, what am I going to ask him? How much should I ask him for? What if he tells me get lost? And don't I realize how difficult times are at the moment? So I'm on the back foot. Let's try and just change the dialogue around. Instead of me going to ask Mr. Goldberg for a donation, I go to Mr. Goldberg and say, I've got this tremendous project that I have put together for the benefit of the community. And I would like to offer you the rare privilege of partnering with me in delivering this project. Certainly, I'm not asking him for a donation. I'm actually making an offer to him. So now he's the one who's got to wriggle out of saying yes. And that is what they are trying to achieve by the opt-out instead of opt-in. They don't think that they're suddenly going to get tens of thousands of new donors. They just want to change that dialogue. When the specialist nurse in the hospital is debating whether to approach the family, rather than feeling that they're on the back foot and they're intruding on somebody else's grief and they're being insensitive and so on, they want the dialogue to change, that it now becomes the expected norm. And the hope is therefore that what they want to do is change those figures slightly so that the 1,600 will be closer to the 3,000 or 5,000. That's possible. What else do these figures tell us, though? What these figures tell us is something very interesting. It tells us that only 0.2% of all people who die in the United Kingdom are actual donors. What's the significance of this? Let's go back. You know, rabbis are obsessed with fundraising. Let's go back to a fundraising analogy again. So somebody comes to me and says, Rabbi, I've left a legacy to the shul in my will. If I'm feeling in a particularly blunt mood that day, I might say to them, why have you left a legacy running the risk that I may daven for you to pass away? Why don't you give the donation now and we will all daven for your welfare? In other words, why are we concentrating our focus on deceased donors when the likelihood of us being a donor is extremely, extremely low? First of all, the older we get, the less chance there is that we can actually be a donor. There are virtually no heart donors over the age of 60. The higher we get, the older we get, the less chance of our organs being viable. Only 10% of heart donors are over 60. None of them are over 70. Only 14% of kidney donors are over 70, and 13% of liver donors. So there's a very, very, very low chance that we could be a potential donor. But what we can be is something else. And let's have a look at the next slide. What we see is that in 2018-19, there were close to 5,000 organ transplants, of which there were 3,594 kidneys transplanted and 1,010 livers, meaning 72% of all organs transplanted were kidneys and 20.24% were livers. So a whopping 92.25% of all organs that are transplanted can be given by people who are still alive. So why wait until we may possibly be one of that 0.27% who could maybe donate an organ if their organs are in good enough condition, when we can give when we are alive? Why leave the legacy when we can make a live donation? And if more emphasis was placed on live donation, I think we could almost wipe out the waiting list. You know, Lord Sachs loves to give the example of the lecturer who drew a tiny black dot on the whiteboard. And he asked the students, what do they see? And the overwhelming majority said, we see a black dot. And only a tiny amount of students said, we see a massive expanse of white. In life, we love to focus on that tiny little bit that we differ, rather than focusing on the enormous expanse that we agree. So if we can demonstrate that live donation is allowed by Jewish law, and we'll look at that a little bit later, we could focus on an enormous amount of good that we can do, rather than the small area of potential difference. So let's look a little bit at the halachic issues now. So we're going to look at three categories. Non-heart beating donation. Donation when cardiac and respiratory activity has ceased. Now, it's important to be aware that the definition that I'm using here is not the DCD, donation after circulatory death, that's used in medical terms. Because donation after circulatory death is extremely problematic, the medical definition of it by Jewish law. What does that mean? It means a person who's fully alive. They're not brain dead. And yet the doctors feel there's no chance of them recovering. They will wheel them into the operating theatre, by mutual consent remove the respirator, wait for the heart to stop beating, and then retrieve the organs. In Jewish law, life's of infinite value. And therefore, even if a person is 100% not going to recover, let's think, I don't know if your community joined in a couple of weeks ago, there was the most inspiring talk by Rebbetzin Dina Horowitz, whose husband Yitzi has ALS. So Yitzi lives because he's connected to a ventilator that allows him to live, allows him to breathe. But he's 100% alive. He has saved people from suicide. He is a person who, both legally and halachically, is alive. Imagine if we were to say he's definitely not going to recover. There's no known cure for ALS at the moment. Let's wheel him into the operating theatre, remove that respirator, allow him to die, and then retrieve the organ. So from Jewish law, that would be absolutely forbidden. What I'm talking here is what's known as non-planned, non-heart beating donation, when the heart has stopped spontaneously from beating. Second category we're going to look at is heart beating donation after brain stem death, when the person is considered to be brain dead, yet their heart is still beating because they're connected to a life support machine. And finally, live donation. So what are the potential problems here? Problem number one, maybe we are interfering with God's plan. If we are interfering with God's plan, then what right do we have to intervene? If God has turned around and said that I wish this person to be ill, do we have a chance to try and change that? We read in the Torah, Ani Hashem Rofecha, I, the Lord, am your healer. We have another verse which seems even more unequivocal. It is I am the one, and there is no God besides me. I cause death and grant life. I strengthen, I heal, and no one can rescue from my hand. You know, they talk about the fellow who's waiting to be admitted into heaven, and he sees someone in a white coat walk past, and he says, "Who's that?" And the angel says, "That's God. He likes to play doctor sometimes." If God is a divine doctor, what right do we have to intervene? Fortunately, we have another verse that tells us Rapo Yerapeh. And this is a beautiful example of the difficulty of accurately translating from one language to another. Because as soon as we translate, we lose some of the nuances of the original text. So we translate this verse, that you shall surely provide for the cure. If one person assaults another person, the assailant is liable to provide for the victim's cure. But that's not what it says in Hebrew. In Hebrew it says, Rapo Yerapeh, you will heal. Indeed, you will heal. Why is this term being duplicated? The Talmud picks up on this, and it says that from this verse, we derive the mandate that doctors have to heal. So we see that God doesn't consider it to be interfering with his divine plan. A challenge was posed. Maybe this only applies to illnesses that were afflicted by other human beings, but perhaps we are not able to heal an illness that's divinely imposed. Think of cancer or something similar. And indeed, some halachic authorities, the Ibn Ezra, Rabbeinu Bachai, Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, feel that that is indeed the halacha. However, the vast majority of halachic authorities follow what the Rashi and Tosfos codify, and they say that the double expression, Rapo, you will heal, or you may heal, illnesses inflicted by human beings, Yerapeh, you may even heal illnesses that appear to have been imposed by God. Indeed, so Maimonides and the Code of Jewish Law both record this as the normative halacha. And what we conclude is that God as a sustainer of life means that God gives us all the resources necessary to be able to procure food and stay alive. Similarly, God as healer, Ani Hashem Rofecha, I, the Lord, am your healer, means that God makes available to us everything necessary in this world to bring about a cure. So researching new medical treatments, trying to master organ transplantation and so on, is not seen as fighting against God. It's seen as working in partnership with God to discover the miracles that he has hidden within nature that gives us the potential to heal. And therefore, physicians should be seen as the agents of God, endowed by him with all the tools they need to heal the sick. When a person is ill, they should pray to God to ask that he grants success to his agents in finding and administering the right cure. And when the treatment's been successful, we thank God for allowing this to happen. So we take the obligation to safeguard our health. We marry it with a permission to seek a cure, and we arrive at an obligation to seek healing. So we've dismissed that objection. What are the other problems? What about desecrating the body? The body contained within it the soul. We know that when we have an artifact of holiness, let's say a siddur, a chumash, a mezuzah, a talis, that is no longer fit for purpose, we don't just throw it in the bin. It's buried with tremendous respect. The body contained within it the soul. Even once that soul has left, the body must be treated with respect. The Khatam Sofer writes that Jews believe that even after death, the deceased is still called a person. We say Adam she'amot ba'oel, a human being who's passed away. Even after death, there remains residual holiness in the body, which served as a receptacle for the soul, and we treat it with respect. We know that the Chevra Kadisha, the Jewish Burial Society, designate one day a year when they fast. They go to the Beis Olam and they ask for forgiveness in case during the course of their holy work of preparing the person for burial, they may have inadvertently done something disrespectful. That's how seriously we take respect of a dead person. And so you can't make an omelette without cracking an egg. You've got to have some form of desecration if you wish to retrieve the organs. Is this a potential roadblock? We're also told that a person should be buried in their entirety, not just partially. The Talmud says, from this we learn that if part of the body is left unburied, it's as if no burial has occurred. There was a novel solution put forward by one of the chief rabbis of Israel, Rabbi Issa Yehuda Unterman. And what he writes is that when you transplant the organ, it comes back to life in the new recipient, and therefore there's no requirement to bury it. The only problem with that suggestion is pointed out by Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. What he says is the obligation to bury the body part kicks in as soon as a person passes away. The organ coming back to life only happens a couple of hours later when it's been retrieved and retransplanted. So that problem still exists. We're not allowed to have any benefit from a dead body. There's going to be an inevitable delay in burial. Maimonides writes that if we delay the burial of a dead person overnight, we're violating a negative commandment, unless the delay is for the honor of the deceased. So you're waiting for a close family member to come and so on. There would perhaps be grounds to wait a bit. But otherwise, we cannot delay. So we've got all these potential problems that would seem to mean that organ transplantation is prohibited. Fortunately, we have a get out of jail free card. And this is called Pikuach Nefesh. Pikuach Nefesh means that everything is done in the quest to save a life. The Torah tells us, Ushmartem es chukoisai ves mishpatai sheyasa osam ha'adam v'chai bahem ani Hashem. These are the laws which a person shall perform and live by them. And the Talmud elaborates, what does it mean and live by them? That if there is a conflict between life and observing the laws, life takes precedence. Maimonides sums it up: if a person takes ill and is about to die, and the doctors advise that they can only be cured by doing something forbidden by Torah law, then we follow the physician's counsel. In case of danger, we violate any of the commandments of the Torah should this bring about a cure, except for idolatry, forbidden sexual relations, and murder, which are prohibited even in the face of danger. Is this a carte blanche? Does this mean we could do whatever, whenever, to save a life? So if, for example, there's somebody who's got diabetes, and there's a worry that they may go into a diabetic coma and desperately, urgently need food, can Rebbetzin Pink cook up a pot of chicken soup on Shabbos morning just in case somebody will faint in shul later on? Obviously not. Can you cruise around in your car the entire Shabbat just in case you see somebody having a heart attack and you can quickly stop and take them to the hospital? Again, clearly not. There's got to be a clear linkage between the suspension of the Torah law and the saving of the life. And this was clarified by Rabbi Yechezkel Landau. Rabbi Yechezkel Landau was the chief rabbi of Prague in the 18th century. And he was asked a question, interestingly enough, by a rabbi in London. They'd carried out surgery to remove stones from somebody's bladder. The surgery hadn't been successful and the person had died. And they'd written to Rabbi Landau to ask, would it be permissible to carry out a post-mortem? They wanted to try and find out what had gone wrong to help for future operations. And the reply of Rabbi Landau became one of the defining factors in this law of Pikuach Nefesh. He establishes this concept known as Cholel Lefonenu. If there is another ill person in the hospital at that same time with that same illness, and therefore our knowledge can save that patient's life, we can violate the law to acquire that knowledge. Obviously, nowadays, when we are dealing with a very small global village, and we can get from one side of the world to another very, very easily, it doesn't necessarily mean in the same hospital at the moment. But what we do know is we need to have a clear linkage between the suspension of the law and the saving of the life. So let's have a look at how it works in the field of organ donation. Right? There are 4 steps. Number 1, the organ is going to be offered by the donor. Number 2, the organ needs to be matched to a potential recipient and accepted. Then the organs are retrieved, and finally they are transplanted. What do we see therefore? We've established a linkage. The organs are only retrieved once we have got a potential recipient. So we've established that link between the suspension of Jewish law in retrieving and saving the person's life. Transplants are now so successful in the UK that a year later, 98% of kidneys, 94% of livers, 83% of hearts, and 71% of lungs are still functioning well. So again, we've established a link. We are suspending the law, and we are clearly saving the life. They're getting clearly more than a year's life expectancy by this procedure. Everything will be done to use retrieved organs, but not every organ is going to be found to be suitable for transplantation. And as I mentioned right at the beginning, this non-utilization rate is increasing, reflecting the aging donor population. Many organs retrieved but found not to be suitable for transplantation are used instead for research, which would pose a problem from the point of view of halacha. The most common reason for decline after retrieval is that when the organ arrives at the transplanting hospital, it's in a worse condition than expected and therefore not safe to transplant. This may be due to poor perfusion, prolonged ischemia, perhaps past history of the donor, various reasons why the organ itself is no use. Another reason may be that the recipient is now too ill. In that case, you will normally fast track the organ to try and find another recipient. If we look at percentages, 5.2% of all donors have none of their organs used at all. And 70% of the organs that are retrieved are not transplanted. And the question is, are these figures slightly too high to break that direct linkage between the suspension of the law in retrieving them and the saving of the life? Some people think that it's still low enough to be permissible. Others feel we need to get that threshold a little higher. Fortunately, the recent change in the law allows us to do that, because the recent change in the law puts in place the ability to have a dialogue around the religious sensibilities and wishes of the potential donor. And therefore, if the specialist nurse for organ donation is made aware that it's very important to the potential donor that the organ is actually going to be used, then they will carry out a more exhaustive level of tests before they retrieve that organ. The bar for retrieval would rise, and it would be as close to zero risk as possible. That would be no non-use. You're never going to get to zero risk, but you get pretty close. Obviously, this will come at a cost. It may mean that there's a lower chance of retrieving the organ in the first place. But from the point of view of Jewish law, again, we can establish that direct linkage between suspension of the law allowing us to retrieve it and saving a life. So what's the bottom line? In Judaism, nothing can be simple. We like to think of life in terms of black and white. The reality is there's an enormous amount of enormous expanse of grey in the in between. So in good Jewish fashion, we can't have one straightforward answer. As they say, 2 Jews and 3 opinions. This evening I'll share with you 3 rabbis and 3 different opinions. First opinion is that of Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Rabbi Auerbach was one of the leading halachic authorities in Israel in the 20th century. And he takes a very revolutionary view, a view that actually is bolder than most secular ethicists. Rabbi Auerbach says that preserving life takes precedence. And he writes as follows: it's obvious that we're obligated to donate an organ from the deceased for the sake of a possible rescue of a living person who's in danger at the moment. And this is the revolutionary part, without regard for the desire of the deceased or their relatives. What's Rabbi Auerbach telling us? In the secular world, the primary ethical consideration in the 21st century is autonomy. To preserve the autonomy of the individual, the ability to make our own decisions without let or hindrance. In the secular world, we're primarily concerned about who gets to make the decision. And therefore, we'll have institutional review bodies, we'll have courts of law, we'll have all sorts of discussions to identify who should make the decision. Once that person's been identified, what the decision is relatively immaterial. So if we determine that it is up to me to make the decision on what I want to do with my body, whether I want to donate the organ or not, if I decide I don't want to donate organs because I looked out the window and I saw that the moon was shining, that is a valid legal decision. As long as I am mentally competent, my decision must be respected irrespective of how illogical or stupid it is. Halacha says we don't look at the identity of the decider. We look at what the decision should be. Once we decide what that decision should be, the identity who's making it is immaterial. So if we have determined, says Rabbi Auerbach, that organ transplantation is life-saving and permissible by Torah law, then whether or not I want my organs or my father or mother or brother or son's organs to be retrieved, says Rabbi Auerbach, is immaterial. Now, Rabbi Auerbach makes it very clear that he's only talking about situations when retrieval is permitted by Jewish law, when the person is considered dead by all definitions. Second view is the exact opposite view. This is a view of somebody called the Sitz Eliezer Rabbi Yehuda Waldenberg. Rabbi Yehuda Waldenberg was another leading authority in medical halacha. He lived next door to the old Shaarei Tzedek hospital. Then you remember the old hospital on Jaffa Street. I think it's now one of the main locations of the Israeli Broadcasting Authority. This was before it moved to its present location opposite Mount Herzl. So he almost became sort of the go-to rabbi for medical questions. And he says the exact opposite of Rabbi Auerbach. He says we shouldn't be transplanting organs. What does he write? He writes, if someone would ask to donate an organ after death for the purpose of transplantation, we would recommend against this. It says the dead are free. There's no obligation for a deceased person to engage in mitzvahs, even for the purpose of saving a life. We know that when we go to the Beis Olam, if our custom is to have our tzitzis on public view, we cover over our tzitzis in the Beis Olam because we don't want to be almost seen as taunting the dead person. I can do a mitzvah, I can wear tzitzit and you can't. So Rabbi Waldenberg says the dead are exempt of mitzvahs. There's no obligation for them to save a life. Upon death, one should return the whole body to the earth from which it came as deemed proper by God. And there's a third middle view. And the middle view is that of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who says that giving is praiseworthy, but not obligatory. And he writes, there's no obligation to donate organs from the deceased, but it's certainly a mitzvah. For even though it's natural to be pained by the loss of the dead body more than the loss of all one's money, there's no obligation to feel this way, and therefore there's a mitzvah not to be paid to this extent and to allow a life to be saved with an organ of the deceased. So we've had three different opinions. Consensus of halachic authority seems to go with Rabbi Feinstein. And therefore, as long as four conditions can be met, an organ may be retrieved for transplantation. Condition number one, the recipient has been identified. And that is always the case. We don't retrieve organs and place them into a freezer. It's not possible. the organs will not survive. So we will always identify the recipient before retrieval goes ahead. The recipient's life is in danger. Again, virtually all organ transplantation requires or is regarding a situation where there's danger to life. There's one or two situations, for example, corneas. There's a debate whether cornea transplantation fulfills this criteria. One school of thought is that blindness carries with it an increased risk of accidents, and therefore it's considered life-threatening. Another school of thought is that the cornea is not an organ, it's just a piece of skin, a piece of tissue, and therefore it's not included in the various prohibitions we looked at earlier, and therefore there's no problem. And the third school of thought is that corneas are problematic. But by and large, most organ transplantation is for life-threatening illnesses. The third condition, the donor must be dead. And this, as we will see in a little bit later when we look at brainstem death, is an area of massive debate. And finally, the donor, according to most authorities, Rabbi Auerbach was a lone voice. Most authorities feel that the donor must have consented to the use of their organs prior to death. So what have we established as a result with non-heart beating donors? If we can establish that that person was dead according to all interpretations of Jewish law prior to their organs being retrieved, then the organs may be retrieved and utilized. Is that actually possible today? At the moment, it's quite difficult for the halachic definition of death to be met before the organs are retrieved. But what's important to be aware is that, as we said, in theory, halakha allows it. Medicine is moving ahead in leaps and bounds, and even though at the moment there may be some potential practical counterindications to allowing organ retrieval from a deceased donor, in theory, halakha allows it, and hopefully, with the way that medicine is going, the issues that are problematic at the moment will be overcome in the near future. What about live donation? Remember, we saw that the vast majority, 92.25% of all organs can be retrieved from live people. So if we can demonstrate that halacha encourages or allows live organ donation, we can make a massive difference. What does Jewish law say? We know that the cost of keeping a patient on dialysis as opposed to giving them an organ transplant is about £150,000. There are about 39,000 people on dialysis at the moment. The vast majority of them could leave dialysis if they received an organ transplantation. Some of them short-term dialysis, some of them aren't suitable for transplantation, vast majority are. So do the maths, times close to 39,000 by 150,000, and work out how many hundreds of millions of pounds we can plough back into the NHS for other areas of treatment, and think then how by one living person donating one kidney, not only will they directly save the life of their recipient, but they will indirectly save the life of thousands of other people because of all this fresh money coming into the NHS. So if we can demonstrate that live donation is encouraged, we'd be able to make a massive difference. So let's have a look at the facts. What can we find in Jewish law that can perhaps be used as a precedent? So we find a law in the Torah that tells us, don't stand idly by the blood of your fellow. If we see somebody drowning, being attacked by wild animals, being set upon by robbers, we've got to intervene. You shall not stand by the shedding of your fellow's blood. But what if this intervention is going to come at the risk of your life? You know, the fellow was waiting to be admitted into Gan Eden, into paradise. And the angel says to him, what have you ever done to deserve it? And he says, I saw an elderly lady being beaten up by a group of yobbos, and I intervened to save her. And the angel said, when was that? And the fellow says, about a minute ago. So in other words, are we obligated to try to save somebody else's life if our own life will be at risk? So we find an episode in the Talmud. In the Talmud, it records a case of Rav Ami. Rav Ami was captured by a bunch of bandits, and his two colleagues were discussing what to do. Rav Yochanan says, let's dig a plot in Gilrose, let's give up hope. Too late, let's get the burial ready. Reish Lakish says, absolutely not. I'm going to try and save my friend. And either I'm going to die in the doing, or I'm going to save him. So what we see from this quote of the Talmud would appear to be that we're allowed to risk our life to save somebody else. And indeed, the Hagos Maimonides quotes this as the defining halacha. The problem is that Maimonides, the Torah, Rabbi Yosef Cairo, and the Shulchan Aruch all omit this particular statement, which appears to indicate that they don't believe that it is a halachically valid statement. So we cannot use this statement to demonstrate an obligation to save somebody else's life. That doesn't mean that everything's off the table, though, because even though we're not obligated to save somebody else's life, maybe we're allowed to if we choose to do so willingly. So there was an episode recorded in the writings of the Radbaz, Rabbi David ben Shlomo ibn Abi Zimra. He was a medieval halachic authority, and he was consulted about a macabre episode in Europe. In those days, you didn't have football, you didn't have cricket or golf, you didn't have tellies. What did you do at a weekend? You went to watch a good public hanging or a flogging, and that was the entertainment. So the question was posed to the rabbi. The local duke had arrested 2 Jews, and he said, I wish to amputate your hand. If you don't allow me to amputate your hand, I'm going to kill your fellow Jew. Is he obligated to allow his hand to be amputated to save his colleague's life? What's the underlying principle here? Are we obligated to give up part of our body to save somebody else? The answer that the Radbaz will give will be able to shed light on whether we can be a living donor. So what does he reply? He replies, Dorocheha darchei noam. The ways of the Torah are ways of pleasantness. It's necessary that the laws of the Torah will accord with reason and rational thought. How could it occur to us that a person should allow their eyes to be blinded or their hand to be cut off so their friend should not be killed? Therefore, I cannot countenance any ruling such as this other than as an act of outstanding piety. Blessed is the portion of one who can withstand this. However, if there's even a possible danger to your life, then you're a pious fool. For the possible danger to your own life takes precedence of the certain danger to his friend. So what's the Radbaz telling us? He's telling us that it's praiseworthy, but not obligatory. As long as the surgery to remove the organ is not dangerous, as long as the donor can continue to live a normal life after donation, as long as the donor must not need prolonged chronic and medical care, and the success rate for the recipient is high, you would be allowed to volunteer to donate an organ. So what's the bottom line? Blood donation, which is virtually zero risk. If you're a particular blood type and they're making an appeal for that blood type, you'd probably be obligated to donate blood. Similarly with regards to bone marrow donation, particularly as nowadays, close to 90% of people who donate their stem cells do so through a procedure called peripheral blood stem cell collection, when the person has a course of injections prior to collection to stimulate the growth of the bone marrow, increase the number of stem cells and white blood cells in the blood, and then the harvesting procedure is very similar to donating blood. Virtually zero risk, virtually zero pain. There is still 10% of a bone marrow that's done in the older manner of aspirating from the pelvis, which is extremely painful, but again, very low risk. And therefore, if you've been swabbed and found to be a potential match, you're probably obligated to agree to have your stem cells harvested to save somebody else's life. What about donating a kidney? So the mortality rate for live kidney donation is about 0.03%, which is about 3 in 10,000. So very, very, very low. High enough that we can't say it's obligated, but low enough that virtually every halachic authority would say that if you wish to, you may indeed donate a kidney. And indeed, it would be tremendously praiseworthy, a great mitzvah. A lobe of liver is still a higher rate at the moment, much higher risk rate than a kidney donation. It's about 0.4%, 1 in 200 for the right lobe, and about 0.1%, 1 in 1,000 for the left lobe. Left lobe is far less common than the right lobe. It's a less successful outcome, the size, and so on. But either way, most halachic authorities feel the risk is low enough that it's permitted. There are some who feel it's still slightly too high. As the operation becomes more commonplace, has greater expertise, that mortality rate will probably drop, and then those in the forbidden camp will move over to the permitted camp. There's no halachic authority that would allow the donation of a second kidney. So think back to the question we posed all the way at the beginning. Dialysis is not a long-term solution. Your life expectancy varies depending on your state of physical health, depends on how old you are when you started dialysis. It can be between approximately 5 to 10 years. There are people who've had dialysis for many, many more years, but that's your average, and therefore it does pose a serious risk to your long-term health expectancy and would be forbidden. But to summarize, halacha absolutely therefore permits live kidney donation. Remember, anybody who donates a kidney will have to undergo a very intensive battery of tests first. And therefore, if the doctors have agreed to retrieve your kidney, you can rest assured that there's no risk or very, very low risk to your health. Halacha absolutely encourages it. And if more Jews would donate kidneys, it would make a tremendous Kiddush Hashem, bring tremendous good name to the name of Judaism. I know that many, many Chabad rabbis around the world have donated kidneys and even lobes of liver to people they've never met in their lives. I think there's a disproportionately high number of extremely religious Jews among the people who have made live donations. What about the final area, a person who is brain dead? Does halacha accept this as the valid criteria or not? Now, there are enormous debates about this. I could spend an entire evening discussing the definition of death. Is it brain death? Is it cardiac death? Which definition is correct? Medically, ethically, legally, halachically, and so on. We don't have time this evening to go into the detailed analysis of brain death. So what I'm going to share with you is what is the bottom line. What is the opinion of the chief rabbi and the London Beit Din? And I'm going to share with you a direct quote from Lord Sachs, because Lord Sachs summed it up extremely well. And he writes as follows: at the heart of Judaism is the principle of the sanctity of life, which flows directly from the proposition in the first chapter of the Bible that we're all created in the image and likeness of God. And this generates several moral consequences, two of which are honor life and save life. Usually these two principles coincide. Sometimes they conflict. The obvious case is taking the heart of someone who's still alive. We may not take one person's life to save another. That's using someone as a means, not an end. What then of cases where there's reasonable disagreement as to whether a person is alive or dead? This can happen when, for example, there's no brain stem activity, but the patient's heart continues to beat. There is a view that brain stem death is an acceptable halachic criteria. This is the view of some halachic authorities, and in fact, it's the view of the chief rabbi of Israel. However, what's very important to be aware, and I received this directly from the chief rabbinate of Israel when I was writing my book, Medicine and Morals, a few years ago, I reached out to the chief rabbinate to find out what their position is and how that would work in England. And what they said to me is as follows. Number one, the definition of brain death in Israel is whole brain death, whereas in England it's brain stem death. Number two, in Israel, there is an integrated system of rabbinic and medical oversight, which is not currently possible in the United Kingdom. And even though the NHS have made massive strides in taking into account the sensitivities of Jewish law, we haven't yet reached a situation where they have in Israel, where there is clear partnership between the halachic and medical authorities to ensure that every case of brain death is indeed valid by halachic criteria as well. And therefore, even though the chief rabbinate in Israel accept brain death, they've said to me that that cannot be transplanted, that cannot be carried over to the United Kingdom. In addition to which, that's quite in addition to the fact that there are many, many halachic authorities, and probably the majority of halachic authorities worldwide, who actually don't believe that brainstem death meets the halachic criteria of death, and instead follow cardiorespiratory death, which is the opinion of the London Beit Din. What's the bottom line of all this? The bottom line is there's no black and there's no white. In view of the significant halachic issues involved, every single case must be judged on its merits. And this is where there's been a big breakthrough recently. Because you can now, if somebody signs up to the organ donor register, they can request that their religious views are taken into account. And the London Beit Din has actually set up a hotline which operates 24/6, which operates 24/6, and which any of the specialist nurses for organ donation can reach out to get a halachic opinion for that specific case. So we'll come back in a moment to summarize what the final bottom line for all the different scenarios are. Very, very briefly going to look at two other issues. One is payment for organs, and the other is xenotransplantation. We've demonstrated that the waiting list could be virtually wiped out if we were to allow payment for organs. Is this something which is moral? So very interesting, there's a Leicester connection here. Professor Sir Peter Bell, who was the former vice president of the Royal College of Surgeons and the emeritus professor of surgery at the University of Leicester, was of the opinion that compensatory payment should be made to a relative who has to go through the medical trauma of donating a kidney to a family member. Now, he put all sorts of caveats in place, and clearly there are tremendous moral issues. Are we going to exploit the poor? Are we going to create a two-tier system of medicine? There's a lot of problems with payment for organs. That's absolutely indisputable. But as we read in the Mishnah, It's not our job to complete the task, but nor can we desist for trying. So if perhaps finding out a way in which payment for organs can be carried out in a manner that won't exploit the poor, if we can find solutions to the practical and ethical problems and allow some form of payment and increase the number of live donors, there'd be no halachic issue with that. And quite the opposite, we'd be doing a tremendous amount of good. What about xenotransplantation? This is my favorite. Why is it my favorite? Because every rabbi's got at least one congregant. Xenotransplantation means taking organs from an animal and transplanting them into a human. So every rabbi's got at least one congregant who says, Rabbi, you don't see me very often. I'm not very observant. I'm not really a shul goer, but I've got a good Yiddish heart. And I'm just waiting for the day when pigs' hearts are transplanted into humans. And I say, no, how's your Chazer's heart doing? But seriously speaking, what's it all about? Are there any issues halachically? If we can have steak and chips, if we can wear leather shoes, then certainly there's no reason why we can't utilize animals to save human lives. The only consideration possibly that needs to be taken into account is the risk of increasing the transmission from the animal world to the human world, as we've seen with the coronavirus, where an animal-based illness has now passed to human beings. And we then have to weigh up the benefit to the individual of receiving a transplant against perhaps the longer-term risk to society as a whole. So let's conclude with a little look at the opt-out. Is it a cause for worry? From the 20th of May, all adults in England are potential organ donors once they die, unless they've recorded a decision not to donate. You may have seen in some areas all sorts of horror stories. The deadline is tomorrow. Opt out now. If you don't opt out, your organs are the property of the UK government. They're going to be, Uncle Yankel's going to visit from Jerusalem and his organs are going to be taken away from him. What's going on? Well, it's all fake news. And this next slide that I'm sharing with you is directly from Dr. Dale Gardner, the clinical head of organ transplantation for the NHS, so direct from the horse's mouth. And what he said is, yes, England will, and indeed since then, England has now moved to an opt-out system. But there's no central register. And what that means is that if you didn't actively opt in or actively opt out, there's no record of you, there's no list of every person in the United Kingdom with their name and address. The only time they will have your details is if you've actively opted out or actively volunteered to opt in. Not only that, but there's no deadline. You can opt in and you can opt out. And next week you can opt out in again. And 2 years later you can opt out again. You can dance the hokey cokey and opt in and out as many times as you wish. There's no deadline. The deadline was for the law coming into effect. But the ability to opt in and out has no deadline. It's constantly available to anybody to change their mind either way. Your organs are not the property of the government. So will my organs automatically be taken if I don't opt out? And the answer to that is no. Family will always be involved. Why will family always be involved? For two reasons. Number one, they don't want the negative publicity. They don't want headlines in the Sun or the Daily Mirror. We was robbed. Dad's kidney was taken without our permission. Because the negative effect on organ donation as a whole will be greater than the benefit of taking that one set of organs, number one. Number two, again, for a utilitarian point of view, it's very expensive to retrieve organs. They don't want to scramble the organ retrieval team, go to all the cost of retrieving the organ, and then find out the guy had hepatitis, the guy, God forbid, had cancer, the guy was a heavy drinker. Therefore, they want to be able to contact close family and get first-hand information. So they will not take your organs if you have not been consulted. In fact, if we look at Wales, where it's already been in place for a couple of years, we see that in 20% of cases, family overruled presumed consent, meaning the person hadn't opted out, the hospital was able legally to retrieve the organs, the family objected, and the organs were not retrieved. So in summary, if you've ever spoken to your family and said you don't want to donate, even if you've not registered any decision, that is a legally valid expression of your wish. It doesn't have to be on the organ donor register. It doesn't even have to be in writing. It could have been a conversation around bagels and smoked salmon on Sunday morning, or over the chopped egg and gefilte fish on Friday night. So the clear message is, let your family know what your decisions are. What's also important is that there's probably very little reason to actively opt out. Because if we actively opt out, we're leaving a footprint. Remember what I said, there's no record of me unless I opt in or opt out. So if I strongly feel that I don't want to donate, rather than actively opting out, just tell your family, tell your friends, or leave a note to say, this is my express decision. And then if perhaps you become one of those 0.2% of the potential donors, then that can be checked. But to leave an active footprint, I believe, can only have negative implications for the Jewish community. Finally, happily for Uncle Yankel, unless he's lived in England for more than 12 months, his organs will not be automatically retrieved. So bottom line, there's very little to worry about by the change in law. It's actively perhaps made things slightly more easy, because if we feel that we may possibly want to donate, but we're worried that at the moment the medical science is not totally in sync with halacha, we can turn around and say, I nominate my rabbi to be consulted if and when the time comes. And then that rabbi's decision will be legally binding, and they will not be able to retrieve the organs if the rabbi doesn't approve. Conversely, if medicine has changed between the time of today and the time the person passes away, and organ donation is halachically permissible, again, the rabbi will be in the position to advise that. So therefore, the key points that we take away is that Judaism prescribes respect towards a dead body. All mitzvahs are suspended to preserve human life except for the 3 cardinal sins. There's strong grounds to say it's permissible to donate an organ after death has been confirmed according to Jewish law, not the way that medicine defines death at the moment. We're not obligated to assume risk nor lose a limb to save another person's life. Donating blood and bone marrow is probably obligatory if we're the only match. According to most halachic authorities, live kidney donation is encouraged, and it's an important Jewish value to be concerned with the needs of others. So even if we are not able to donate, perhaps we're not well enough to be a live donor, but if we can educate others and encourage live donation, that's a tremendous Jewish value to do so. If we can encourage greater research into organ retrieval, so that we could arrive at a stage where the technical difficulties with retrieval from the point of Jewish law are overcome, and that all Jews would then be able to donate posthumously in line with halacha, again, that's a tremendous Jewish value to be concerned about this and to educate people about the realities of organ donation. Anybody who wants to know more about live donation, the NHS has an enormous amount of information on their website. There are also Jewish organizations that facilitate this. If anybody wants, I can put them in touch with somebody in the United Kingdom who was a live donor and is happy to talk to them about it. And finally, in the modern world of fast-moving medicine in which we live, where today's taboo is tomorrow's routine, and where yesterday's unthinkable is becomes today's debatable, and then tomorrow's unexceptionable, we must strengthen and reaffirm our faith in God and His Torah, even if it forces us to reach the unpalatable realization that we're fallible in our logic and understanding. Thank you for listening. If any of you got any questions, please feel free to feed them to Rabbi Pink, who will pose them to me.
Thank you, Rabbi Pink, Rabbi Yehuda from Solihull. And we're going to take questions. I don't think I'm looking at it. I don't think I've got a chat, so people can either one at a time. If you want to, I think you can raise hands if you want to say something. If you ask a question, please ask now. Just unmute yourself. So who are we going to? Anybody wants to ask a question? Yes, Sandra. Off you go. Unmute yourself, Sandra.
I have.
Off you go, Sandra.
If one is over 70, the chances are I wouldn't be good to anybody, yeah?
The older a person, again, let's use this car analogy again. Think of a car. The lower the mileage, the more value, the longer life there's going to be in that car. So hopefully the longer a life that we have, the more wear and tear our organs have had. There's no formal upper limit for retrieval of organs, but the reality is that the older we are, the less chance of them being suitable. And as I shared the statistics earlier about the various ages, the chance of over 70, there's no hearts that are donated by people over 70. Only 40% of kidneys and 13% of livers are donated by those over 70. And again, it keeps going up, the percentage keeps dropping and dropping. So there's no absolute, the answer, there's no black and white. I think they recently retrieved a kidney from somebody who was in their mid-80s. So there's no definitive upper limit. It will depend very much on the willingness, the state of the organ, the willingness of the surgeon to proceed, the urgency of the patient waiting. The more urgent the patient's needs, the more risk. It's better to take a kidney that may have 50% function than a kidney with, than leave the person with zero function. Also, it depends how much the family of the potential donor is pushing for their organs to be retrieved.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else got any other questions? Wave your hand. I can know, and you can. Yes, David Moshe. Off you go.
Rabbi, you remember a few weeks ago, I mentioned to you that the Board of Deputies had produced a fact sheet, how to make sure your organ donation wishes are respected. And I'd like to thank you for instigating this evening, and to Rabbi Yehuda for his inspirational and unbelievable exposition of the subject. It has been truly magnificent. I think we're all much wiser, and we are most grateful for the considerable amount of time that you've put into making this preparation for us. And I can only say thank you. It's helped us all, and God be with you.
Thank you, David. And if I'm not mistaken, most of what's written on that organ donation sheet for the deputies is covered by what I spoke, because they were discussing it with me when they were drawing it up. I haven't seen the final thing recently, but I would imagine that it probably is pretty much in line with what I said. Just by way of interest, the current rate of donation by deceased donors in the Jewish community is approximately the same as among the community as a whole, which is about 0.25% of organs that were retrieved from deceased donors came from Jewish donors, and Jews are about 0.24% of the population. This information, very interesting. It's not, you won't find that anywhere, but Professor David Katz, who have...
I was going to mention him, yes.
Any medics among you, Professor David Katz was deeply involved in the various discussions. What's really important to be aware as well is it's a massive sea change that the NHS have taken into account the wishes of the Jewish community, which has been a massive change and a massive, even though the reality is that our ability to be a potential donor is very, very low. It's really important to express gratitude for the NHS for their willingness to engage with the Jewish community. And sort of inadvertently, when they were discussing this with Professor Katz, they somehow let a statistic slip, which allowed him to work out how many Jews are giving organs at the moment, which, as I said, is about in line with our proportion of the population as a whole.
Thank you.
The answer to that is, if you've got a question, a halakhic question, ask your rabbi and he will find an answer for you. Thank you, Rabbi Pink, Leicester.
Okay. Rabbi Pink, could I ask a question? Is there any room to be able to donate one's organs for scientific research?
No. Simple answer. The answer is no. Remember, think back to what Rabbi Landau said. There's got to be a clear linkage between the saving of the life and the setting the laws on the side. The level of usage of donated organs isn't sufficient to justify that, to demonstrate that direct linkage. It's a very, very indirect linkage. Even though in this country it's been tightened up dramatically since the Alder Hey scandal, when people thought that they were donating organs for research and they found out that they were being just often stored and not being used for research at all. And it's great to see Martin on the screen here tonight. Martin gave me an amazing book by somebody called Dr. Morris Papworth. Dr. Morris Papworth was a Jewish doctor who basically virtually had his career ruined because he became a whistleblower, exposing some of the deficiencies in medical research. So it's a fascinating topic, and people often believe there was a scandal recently in America where they discovered that people thought that they noted their bodies for medical research, and they were being used to test what happens when explosives blow up bodies. So bottom line is that the halacha would not allow does not allow bodies to be used for research. And if an organ was retrieved legally by halachic considerations, and then unfortunately it was part of that 70% of organs that couldn't be used, that organ by Jewish law should be given back and buried.
Okay, thank you. Second question, you mentioned that according to halacha, there would be there's room for donation, but you said here in the UK, because of the definition and when the organs are retrieved at the time of death, there is a problem. How does that practically make a difference to somebody wanting to donate their organs after death when this full question?
At the moment, again, it depends. There may be situations when death has been declared both by brain stem criteria and cardiorespiratory criteria, more likely with kidneys which survive longer than hearts, although they are doing research now and they've recently restarted a heart. The only problem with that is you've then got to ask the question, if the heart was able to be restarted for the donor, for the recipient, why could it have not been restarted for the donor? And again, it depends. There are some situations where the donor was so frail and so on that wouldn't be a possibility. There's another factor to throw into the mix. And the bottom line of all of it is that the vast, vast majority of organs that are retrieved in this country are retrieved under the criteria of brainstem death. Most halachic authorities, as I said, don't accept that criteria. Indeed, it's interesting, even within the ethical world, there's a massive debate as to whether it is indeed a valid criteria. And the ethical world have actually moved to the exact opposite direction of the Jewish world. What the ethical world have put forward is to say, who cares? In other words, there's a fundamental principle at the moment known as the dead donor rule. The donor must be dead before you can retrieve the organs. And there's a massive school of thought saying now, why? Why can we not say that that person is never going to recover? And therefore, as long as we can determine that the person is never going to recover, does it matter whether they are definitely dead or not? let us actually retrieve the organs and directly cause their death. Jewish law says that life is of infinite value. And therefore, even if a person only has a day or a week left to live, even if a person will definitely never recover, they're in a state, let's say they're in PVS, persistent vegetative state, an irreversible coma, and will never recover. But nevertheless, they are alive at this moment in time. We cannot do anything to hasten their death, even if it means that we will not be able to save another person as a result. Not only that, but we have a concept called a goses. Goses means a person at the very last stage of life when they're compared to a flickering candle. If you move a flickering candle, it will go out. If you leave it there, it might flicker for a few more minutes before it goes out. If we move a person at the very last stages of life, we may hasten their life. And if by Jewish law, if something is of infinite value, and even if we hasten their demise just by a few minutes, we are considered to have taken their life. And therefore, a spin-off of this is, even if we wish to accept brain stem death as a valid criteria, the problem we have is actually determining that the person is indeed brain dead, because we need to carry out some tests. And these tests will involve interaction with the body, which may hasten that person's death. So therefore, practically speaking, at the moment, there's no black or white. It's vital that the person, if the person wishes to donate, that they actually record the name of the halachic authority that they wish to be consulted. And then, if and when that situation arises, that halachic authority can be consulted and can give a definitive answer. What's very important to understand is that it's a very specialized field, and that if somebody is nominating their local rabbi, they're nominating their local rabbi not to be the one making the final decision, but to be the one who's going to contact, whether it be the Dayan on the Bet Din or some other world-famous halachic authority of medical law, to determine what the specific situation is in their case. So there's no and there's no yes. There may be situations where even today a Jewish person can donate an organ posthumously. There will be many situations where it's not possible.
So, practically speaking, can I sum that up to say that a person should call this London Beth Din hotline and they will advise the hospital how to proceed?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Super.
And every hospital's got that, and I'm actually giving a lecture on the 25th of August to the national. They have the National Organization of Specialist Organ Donor Nurses have a seminar once a month, and they're dedicating the next seminar to understanding the Jewish position on organ donation, and more practically speaking, what to do if they've got a Jewish person, what numbers to call, what they need to be aware of, how to reach out to get a definitive ruling. So that's again, the NHS is really trying hard to respect Jewish sensibilities.
Super. Thank you. Do we have any other
What they
questions?
say is what you say.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes, I'd like to make a question, Rabbi.
Yes,
Ian
Ian.
Simons.
Hi, Ian.
Hi.
After Ian, I think Roger had his hand up as well,
Okay.
or whoever's there.
So is it me or is it Roger?
Ian, off you go.
Ian first, yeah.
Right. Well, listen, it's very interesting to listen to what you're saying, Rabbi. 25 years, we lost a son, people knew, Darren, bless him, and we had no idea before going into hospital what would happen. And he had a brain tumor, and we decided to donate a part of his body. But in those days, Beth Din wasn't around, and we couldn't get any help at all. But eventually we did get help, and they told us what we could do and what we couldn't do. They said that his kidneys were fine, but only one kidney, and his eyes weren't good either.
No,
So it was just
he didn't want to donate his eyes. He'd said that. He didn't want to do corneas.
So what we did, we donated one of his kidneys, and I don't know the right word because I'm upset, but we got such pleasure to know that somebody came off of dialysis and used Darren's kidney. And who knows, he might be still alive now. But we got so much help for doing it. So
Comfort,
I just
a lot of comfort.
and comfort. Yes, thank you is one word. So I just wanted to sort of say that.
Thank you, Ian, for sharing that. And that's exactly what Rabbi Auerbach and Rabbi Feinstein were both talking about, the ability, as much as we grieve, to also be able to have that knowledge that we've been able to save, as long as it's within the halachic parameters, that, I don't want to use the term a person hasn't died in vain. Every single death is extremely difficult, but if we can know, as Ian has said, the comfort that Ian and Donna took from knowing that their son's kidney was able to give somebody else life is something that you can hold on for so many years going forward.
Thank you. Roger, you want to ask a question or say something?
It was really going to be Ruth who will ask a question in a moment. I just wanted to say, even my first day going into the anatomy dissection room as a medical student back in 1960, we were told by the professor of anatomy, all these people have donated their bodies for dissection. They're to be treated with respect, because when we finish with them, they're all going to be buried with a service. And that's something which was there from my very first day in medical school. And I just thought I would pass that bit on. My own area where I've been involved in donation has not been organ donation, it's been tissue donation, and not to save a life. And it's been in the more controversial field of assisted conception, IVF, egg donation, and the whole question of donor insemination as well, which is out of this area that you're talking about, but is fascinating too.
Rabbi, I think you'll have to book another talk, because Roger, my favourite topic.
Oh, wonderful! Mine too.
Reproduction.
Yes.
Not many miles away from you, you've got the Care Hospital in Nottingham.
That's right.
Simon Fischel, who's one of the world leaders in much of this, who's a nice boy. But it's fascinating. I mean, tissue is a very different topic, and there's a massive debate as to whether tissue, which is often microscopic and so on, is or very small amounts is. And according to many opinions, tissue donation isn't an issue.
Right. Yeah.
So, we'll have to talk about that at some other stage.
Okay. Ruth wanted to ask a question.
Yes, I wanted to ask a question about the children under 18 not being allowed to donate. And I wasn't sure whether this was a Jewish ruling or what it was, because a few years ago I organized a meeting about end of life, and one of the speakers that we had was a professor, Maggie Squee. She came from around the Birmingham area, and her subject was organ donation. During the course of her talking to us at this meeting, we were shown a short film about a boy who had died and had expressed a wish to donate his organs. And what had happened was he'd gone with his grandma to a shop and seen an organ donor card. He said to his grandma, "What's that?" And she said, "Well, it's an organ donor card," explained to him the reason. And he said, "If anything happened to me, I would like my parts to be used," which was an amazing thing for a young child. I think he was 8 or 10 or something like that. And during the course of this speaker talking to us, we were shown a film made by the father of this boy who had had an accident and sadly died, and his organs were donated. And it was so, so moving. The child had taken responsibility, as children can very often do, even if they aren't 18. And he had wanted someone to live if he wasn't able to. So,
okay, so I think you just slightly misunderstood, because what we said was the opt-out law does not apply to people. Meaning the opt-out law means that unless you've registered a decision not to donate, you'll be considered a potential donor. What
Right,
the
that's
law says is that that assumption doesn't apply to people. In other words, under 18, you have got to make a conscious decision to donate, whereas over 18, you are considered to be automatically a potential donor unless you've made that decision to opt out. So it's not saying that organs can't be retrieved from under 18s. It's saying that they're not considered to be automatic candidates.
brilliant answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, I think that unless anybody else gives me a wave to show they want to ask a question, I think oh, David Moshe. Oh, you're gonna have to unmute yourself, David Moshe. I can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, go on, David Moshe.
I just want to know if Rabbi Yehuda wants a copy of the Board of Deputies.
I'm not mistaken, I think they emailed it to me. It's among my millions of emails
Okay,
I had to read. But the Chief Rabbi's office also gave out a summary of it recently as well, which I can send to Rabbi Pink to circulate as well.
Thank you very, very much. I'll say that hopefully I'm looking forward to big strides in medical advancement, where we'll be able to print the organs on 3D printers, and we'll be able to grow the organs in peri dishes, and there'll be no need to have to go through all this trouble and tribulation, and that should be very soon. And we should have Mocha Hashem Elokim Dumi Al Kolpanim Hashem to remove all suffering and all illness, and we should all have a world of peace, because that is where we're headed for. You can see it naturally happening. We can see the trajectory of it, and it should be sooner than we think. Mashiach coming very soon. Thank you very, very much, Rabbi Pink.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Rabbi Yehuda, thank you very much again, as usual. Brilliant, very clear. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Martin. Good to see that you're well and enjoying the nice warm weather sitting outside.
Can I ask if this talk has been recorded? Because there are a number of people that expressed a wish to see it and were unavailable to do so.
Yeah, I'm aware of that, and those people who will contact me, I'll make arrangements for those people within the community. It's not going to go on social media, not being published.
No, okay.
But if somebody individually wants to see something, I'll arrange for them to be able to see it.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Laila Tov, everybody. Thank you.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov, everybody.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.